Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed."
We come to think about the story of Thomas. Let's pray together. God, in this story, help us to find Thomas as a friend, that we would be blessed as those who have not seen, yet still believe. Amen. I struggle with the story of Thomas because I think it's a great story until something that Jesus says at the end, which sometimes lands like a bit of a telling off. And I feel sorry for Thomas. Because of this telling off, he is often referred to doubting Thomas. And that's made to seem like a bit of a bad thing. But this Sunday I want to rename him Believing Thomas. Because ultimately that's where he lands, and that's what he should be known for. And I want us to find in his story our story. Because John, which is probably the last gospel to be written, he's probably aware, probably at least of Mark's gospel. But he wants us to have Thomas's story. He's the only gospel writer who tells us Thomas's story in the resurrection. And he wants us to have Thomas's story because it's so important. Because like Thomas, we were not in the upper room on that first Easter Sunday. We were outside. And so we have to have another kind of a story. Now, just on the next slide, the bit that I always struggle with, and I'm going to come to a translation here that's different, but it's when Jesus says to Thomas, "Stop doubting." Now, I'm going to change that word doubting at the end there because I think it's a bad translation of the Greek. But most English versions do have the word doubt there. Stop doubting and believe. Because you have seen me, you have believed. And it's almost like, so the one way of reading this is, you're only believing in me because you've seen me. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And it feels that Jesus is saying to Thomas almost, you asked for too much, Thomas. You shouldn't have needed all this proof. And everybody's going to be so much better off if they don't see. They'll be blessed if they don't see. And I have to say, see that question that we asked a moment ago, would you rather have been in the upper room or experienced Jesus as we do in our fellowship? Probably, if I was being really honest, I'd have preferred to have been in the upper room. Because that would have got rid of a lot of doubt. But it wasn't. And yet Jesus said it's more blessed not to have seen. I'm going, Jesus, a little bit of seeing would help. Because not seeing's hard. And yet there seems something counterintuitive about this. Blessed are those who haven't seen. And I reckon I'm not the only one. I think most of us struggle with the fact that we don't see. And yet Jesus is telling us that's blessed. We're going to come back to this ending, and I'm going to reclaim it because actually I don't think it's a telling off. And I think these words here are our friend. So let's just look at the story and what happens in that upper room. The first thing to note is that Thomas is a twin. Out of interest, anybody here a twin this morning? Yeah, a few twins. Oh, look at them, sitting next to each other. Look at that. That's amazing. The twins have twinned. Not of each other, by the way. Although, yeah. It's an interesting experience being a twin, isn't it? Yeah, you're both nodding. And we've talked about that. But Thomas is our twin this morning. Thomas is the one who disbelieves, and I think he speaks to our disbelieving, our struggling. So let's look at the story. Firstly, I want to notice that Thomas is brave. There's two bits of evidence for that. The first is, on the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for the fear of the Jewish leaders, everybody's scared to go outside, except for one person. Who? Thomas. Thomas is the one brave enough to be outside, so we know he's brave. The other thing about Thomas, if we look at the next bit, and this is what happens. Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, that means twin, that's Greek for twin, one of the 12 was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." Now, there's been psychology experiments done on this. If you're in a room of 11 people, and they all say, "We've had this experience," and there's huge pressure to go on with it. You can see these on the internet. It's like these experiments. I should have looked up the exact example, but for example, they'll play a room people and they'll say, "This animal is a dog." Hands up who agrees it's a dog. And everybody in the room, 11 of them are actors and one of them is a genuine person, all say, "Oh, that's a dog." And then they play them a cat. And they get the 11 volunteers all to say, "Oh, that's a dog." Do you know what the 12th normally does? They normally say, "Oh, that must be a dog as well." Because you doubt yourself when you're surrounded by other people. But Thomas is surrounded by, 10 other people at least, probably a few more, who've all said, "We've seen the Lord." And he refuses to go along with it. And I admire him for that. Often I have an experience of talking to you, and you'll often say things to me like, I'm not like other people in the church. I don't find it as easy to believe as other people in the church seem to find it easy to believe. And I want to go, we should all go around and have a little private conversation with each other, because we all struggle with this. But what I love about Thomas is he says, "I'm not having it. I'm not going along with it." He's not going to be coerced to say this is a cat when he knows it's a dog. So he says, this is really visceral. "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now, that's a really strange thing. I mean, imagine saying, "Jesus has got wounds. I want to stick my hand into one of them. And see those nail marks that caused him absolute agony? I want to stick my finger into one of them." What kind of thing is going on here with Thomas? I've got two possible ideas. One, he is not wanting to be hoodwinked into belief. Deep down, he's probably thinking, these disciples have been conned when they see Jesus. I'm going to set myself a higher standard of proof here. I don't just want a vision, I want to be able to stick my hand into his side. In other words, I want to make it really difficult for God to change my mind. What Thomas is saying is, I would rather have certain disbelief than uncertain faith. I would rather have certain disbelief than uncertain faith. In other words, I would rather have the certainties, the black and white sureties of not believing than all the uncertainty of having faith. And do you notice here that faith always brings with it uncertainty? It's hard having faith because it doesn't give you certainty. Faith and certainty are not the same thing. The other thing is, I think Thomas is angry. I think he's angry at Jesus for having appeared to the 11 disciples or the 10 rather, because Judas is not around, when he was out the room. What was Jesus playing at? Jesus has engineered this situation where Jesus has gone in the evening of the first day of the week. Thomas is going to be back later on. Jesus could go, I'll wait till Thomas gets back. He's the one brave enough. But Jesus goes, no, I am going to appear when Thomas is not there. And I wonder if Thomas is angry at Jesus for giving the 10 disciples an experience that he hasn't had. I don't know if you've ever felt that frustration in church, where you feel that God is giving everybody else around you this happy experience of Christian faith, and you're being missed out. And you feel frustrated. I think there's something of that anger in Thomas saying, I want to put my hand into his hand. I want to add to his wounds because he has hurt me. I'm going to hurt him back. What's really interesting on the next slide is, and we know this because of the story, is that Jesus is actually in the room at this point. We know that because later on he quotes Thomas's words. So Jesus is unseen, Jesus is silent, but Jesus is present and Jesus hears. And we know that for the next week, Jesus is going to wait. Jesus is in the room, he's silent, he's hearing Thomas, but he's present. He's going to wait. Jesus is doing something very specific and intentional here. Why does Jesus do this? Why does Jesus give an experience of silence and of waiting to someone who already feels left out? The only answer can be that there is some kind of power in the waiting. A secret, hidden, unfelt power is in the waiting. The Hebrew word for wait is kavah, kavah. And it also means to weave, to weave. If you're a Hebrew, if you're Hebrew and you're waiting, you're also weaving. And the notion behind this is that in the waiting, there's some kind of silent, hidden work going on that wouldn't happen if we weren't waiting. I don't know if any of you feel that you are waiting for something at the moment. I don't know if any of you feel that you've been waiting a long time. One of the features of waiting, there are two kinds of waiting. The first kind of waiting is the waiting where you know the thing that you wait for is going to happen eventually. And the second kind of waiting is the thing that you wait for, you don't know if it's going to happen eventually. This is Thomas's kind. But in the waiting, kavah is the weaving. And I want to suggest that for the things that we wait for at the moment, maybe an experience of Jesus being silent or some other individual being silent, I want to suggest that it's an experience of weaving. And I want to go even further. I want to suggest it might have been divinely planned. Because God seems to like to make his people wait. Not because God is cruel, but because God is a weaver. So just trust that there might be weaving in your waiting. And we're going to come to that with Thomas on the next slide. A week later, so Jesus waited a week. Now, God's waiting periods in the Bible can range from 1 week to 40 days to 40 years, if you're the Israelites. And I think for some people they're even longer. They all feel like 40 years. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And now Thomas has been included in the thing that everybody else got last week. And this might be enough. And then Jesus makes himself so vulnerable. He says to Thomas, this is so intimate. He's allowing Thomas to touch his body in the place where he has been wounded. Now, post-resurrection wounds, I don't think carry the same pain, but I still think they're intimately part of ourselves. And Jesus says to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Come into me. And then stop doubting and believe. We're going to change that word doubting in a minute. And then Thomas says to him this, my Lord and my God. Now, we don't fully appreciate, because we're so used to saying that Jesus is God, we don't appreciate how radical those last two words are. If you were a Jew, you were brought up with the greatest commandment that God is God alone. You shall have no other gods before me. You were also brought up with the second commandment, which told you that God could take the form of no created thing. So you knew that all the other nations, they had lots of things who were gods. And sometimes they even said that people were gods. But if you were a Jew, you never, ever did that. God was unseen. God might appear sometimes in fire. If you were very lucky, like Moses, you got to see the back of God, but you didn't get to see God's face. But you never, ever said that a human being was God. But Thomas breaks all the restraints of his Jewish upbringing, all the restraints of religious orthodoxy of his day, and he says, my God. And nobody in John's gospel has said that as explicitly as Thomas has. So I want to make a wee connection here. This is a random survey of Jesus' disciples. On the next slide. Which percentage of disciples, I do realize the animation hasn't worked here, so you know the answer already. Which percentage of disciples who have had Easter Day experience, the same experience as all the other disciples, in other words, as everyone else, so they got to have the crowd mass experience, got to be in the room when it happened, and who have called Jesus God. So I'm sorry for the grammar there, it's all lumped together. But what I'm saying, what percentage of the disciples who had the Easter Day experience also called Jesus God? 0%. None of them. So the ones who had the instant, wow, you're in at the start experience, still haven't moved to the full depth of who Jesus is. Whereas, in our survey, which you also have the answers for, which percentage of disciples who missed out on the Easter Day experience were outside the room, had to rely on other people, vigorously stated their objections, possibly Freudianly mixing in grief and anger, waited a week, and then called Jesus God? Which percentage? 100%. In other words, I want to say that this painful, excluding, waiting experience of Thomas, where he is vocal about his frustration and his anger, has led him not to a weaker experience of Jesus, but a deeper experience of Jesus. And I think that's good news for all of us who are Thomas's twins, all of us who are outside the room, all of us who wrestle with Jesus, all of us who have to wait for things, all of us who are annoyed with Jesus because he didn't show up to us the same way that it feels that he showed up to everybody else. That experience leads to a deeper experience of God and of Jesus, not a shallower one. The next slide. There are two kinds of Easter story in the Gospels. And they're mixed together, but these two elements appear. There are empty tomb stories. That's Mark's big speciality. But there are also lots of vision stories. And these vision stories are, I want to suggest, not just for a few select hardcore disciples, but vision stories of experiencing Jesus as risen, I want to suggest, are actually part of the normal experience of being a follower of Jesus. And you might be saying, that's all kooky and that's kind of wacky and that's a bit out there. And I want to say yes. you've heard me talk about this lots of times before, but too often in our churches, we have lived with dumbed down, rational experiences of Jesus. And vision experiences of Jesus are actually what transformed the early church, like what Thomas is having, and also us. I was recently reading a wonderful book, which I really loved, by a man called Lawrence Freeman, and it's called Jesus, the Teacher Within. And in it, he argues that the experience of Jesus within and experiencing Jesus in some form of almost converting visionary experience is actually what changes us. And he quotes another man called William James. Those of you who were in Weem last week heard about this. Who says that the conversion experience of Jesus is the thing that changes us. Now, he says sometimes it happens in an instant. I know people who've had experiences of the presence of Jesus which lasted about a second. They might happen in strange ways with strange people doing things. They might sometimes have a kind of ordinary quality to them, but they are nearly almost an experience in which we go, wow, there is something else here. And Jesus might be part of us. Sometimes it happens, and then the response takes about another 10 years to happen. And some of you will be thinking, I haven't had that experience ever. Well, I'm going to pray today that you have it. Sometimes you have it, and then the memory of it dims, and it doesn't seem quite as important anymore. But these experiences in Easter of a sense of presence of Jesus are what change us and bring us into the depth of God. And what I want to say to us is if you've had experiences like that, even if they've lasted a second, normally they happen, you think, whoa, I don't want to invest too much in this because I don't really think Jesus is that powerful. I want you to just trust that God knows what God's doing in those experiences. And then trust the God who gave you that moment with the rest of your life. Give him your trust. On the next slide. Vision of Jesus is still it's a huge part of faith. It is not seeing. It is not proof. It is not 100% certainty, but it is a sense of presence. Sometimes it is confusing. It comes in no predictable way. It is often fleeting. Usually, if you try and explain it to someone else, you're worried that they'll think you're stupid. And when responded to, though, it is transformative. And if you haven't had those experiences or feel that you've been shortchanged, just say to God, God, I would like to meet you. There's a line in the Psalms, may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. Seek, seek, seek. These are what change us. On the next slide. And I want to change the ending here. Jesus, that phrase, stop doubting, that is a bad translation of the Greek. There are other Greek words for doubt, and that's not what's used there. Just on the next slide. The word is really disbelieve. It's the conscious choice not to believe unless I'm given certainty. That's what Thomas has done. And Jesus is saying, don't operate in a framework where you demand 100% proof, otherwise you're not going to believe. Because that's not faith. That's certainty. That is the paradigm that some scientists during the era of Dawkins tried to push onto us. Certainty is not faith. Disbelief is the choice to say, I'm not going to believe unless I get an absolute 100% proof. I'm not going to believe unless I get to put my hand in his hand or put my hand in his side. Jesus says, don't do that, but instead believe. And the word belief still contains doubt. We know that from some of the other resurrection experiences. Sorry, just going back. So if we can go back to the slide before. My Lord and my God. And then this blessing. Because you have seen me, you have believed, to Thomas. But blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed. And that is our experience. And Jesus is saying we are blessed. He's actually saying the people who weren't in the upper room are blessed. Jesus actually, faced with that question, would you rather have been in the upper room and seen me or experience me as you do in Aberfeldy today, would actually say you're more blessed if you have the Aberfeldy experience of not seeing. There's something more powerful, more potent in that. So rejoice in that. we've got the better end of the deal here. Hard to believe, but we have. That kind of faith, not based on certainty, asking questions, being made to wait, being made to wrestle, but then having that deeper experience of God, is incredibly powerful and fruitful. And I know that because I've seen it in your lives. In Thomas's story, the legend is, anybody know which country Thomas was alleged to have gone to after? India. Yeah, he's alleged. We're not quite sure of this or not, but he probably went to Kerala, which is the part of India that I went to and lived there for a year. And I do this slightly, it's not stalking, okay? It's not stalking, I promise you. But if ever I see people who look like they might be from South India, anywhere, I hover around them. I do. And I was in the co-op last week, and there was a whole bunch of South Indians in the co-op, or at least they looked like they were. I wasn't sure. And I was kind of hovering over. And to my great disappointment, they were speaking English to each other. So I couldn't work out what they were saying. But eventually, I'd seen them in the shop, and I'd lacked courage. And then eventually, I went out to the car park, and I just went up to the guy, and I said, excuse me, are you from South India? And he went, yes. I'm like, yes. And my kids are so embarrassed of me doing this. I think Anna is too at times. I said, which part of South India are you from? He said, we're from Kerala. I said, Nyan Malayalam samsari kunnu. And they go, no way, you speak Malayalam. So they came out, and what I always do with Indians whenever they speak Malayalam is I always take a selfie with them. And at this stage, I would argue that the stalking phase is over, and we've all become friends, as evidenced. I do not. Do these people look like they're being coerced? And they always say, this is my ego. Okay, sorry. They always say, how long were you in India for? I say 1 year. 1 year, and you learnt this much Malayalam. Thank you very much. But yeah, so that's them. And actually, they live in Birmingham, those guys. But on to the next one. Oh, yeah. So the whole point of Kerala, though, is that Thomas went there. And when I lived there, I went to some of the sites where he was meant to have gone. One of them still has a statue of Thomas. I don't know if you recognize that one of the people there is a statue, arriving on the scene. But he went, and there are loads of Christians in Kerala because of Thomas. And when the missionaries arrived from the UK in about the 1800s, they were shocked to discover loads of Keralan Christians. And it was all because of believing Thomas. This man who had wrestled with his doubts and yet shared the gospel. And the impact is huge. This here, on the next slide, this is the Mararaman Convention, which has about 100,000 people speaking at it, attending it rather, and it's organized by the Mar Thoma Church. Mar, son, Thoma, Thomas. It's the son of Thomas Church. The church in India today bears Thomas's name. I went to this in 1994. The speaker was George Carey, and I decided I would preach as well at the Mararaman Convention. As you can see, nobody listened to me, but I'm still there. There's 100,000 Christians, all of them saying we're the sons of Thomas. We're the twins of Thomas, almost. And Malayali Christians have gone all over the world. Here we are here, on the next slide. This is Paul Singh, and he is the Episcopal priest in Kirriemuir. And that's me and him meeting up in Dunkeld. This is me doing the stalking thing in Belfast Airport. This is a family from Ballymena in Northern Ireland who are Catholic Christians descended from Thomas. The Catholic Christians also say we're Thomas Christians as well. And this is, on the next slide, this is a group in Princes Street in Edinburgh. And they said to me, they're all Mar Thoma Christians. And they're all over the place. Why is that? Next slide. Because blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. And it began with Thomas, and it carries on to us.